Okay, so thank you everyone. Good day everyone. Thank you for joining today's ESG in Times of COVID-19 webinar organized by the Hong Kong Green Finance Association's ESG Disclosure and Integration Working Group, which is co-chaired by Joy from CSAP and Sally from HKGFA. My name is Tracy Wong Harris, Deputy Secretary General of the Hong Kong Green Finance Association. I'll be your moderator of the webinar. Some housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. During our webinar, we will have an open floor Q&A session. So we would like your active participation. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post your questions. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. CS, can you wave and say hello?
Yeah, sure.
So CS,
how are you, everybody?
So CS wear many, good. CS wear many hats. He is the GM of BIM Society, a local green building certification body, the chairman of the Hong Kong Quality Assurance Agency, HKGFA, as well as being a barista. Now, Katherine Ng, COO and Head of Policy at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Katherine, can you say hello?
Hi.
Good. Sebastian Schiele, Head of Passive Mandate Sales of Europe and APAC of DWS. Sebastian, can you say hello?
Hello, good afternoon.
Great. Tim Chen, Senior Analyst of ESG Research and Integration of Manulife Investment Management. Tim, can you say hello?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good. So let's go straight to today's topic. Can I ask all our speakers to share their observations on how COVID-19 impact on the ESG and how ESG investing perform in times of COVID-19? Let's start from the investors and asset managers' point of view. Shall we start with Tim and followed by Sebastian? Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Tracy. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and thank you, HKGFA, for hosting this webinar. So maybe I'll just spend a couple of minutes on how and why good ESG companies outperform others during the crisis. And I think at the beginning, I think COVID-19 is a testament to the value of sustainable investing. According to MSCI, the ESG Leaders Index of all regions, including Asia, outperformed in Q1 compared with non-ESG counterparts. This is actually not just an equity phenomenon. Bank of America also shows analysis that on green bonds, and green bonds outperform the equivalent investment grade bond as well. On the asset flow side, there is some data from Morningstar show that ESG funds record significant inflow, while many other funds had outflow as investors becoming more defensive. So I think it is quite apparent that many ESG funds outperform their counterparts during the crisis, but I think it's more important to see why the companies outperform rather than the data itself. So one obvious reason for this outperformance is that because ESG funds generally underweight fossil fuel companies, because as you may know, oil price perform poorly, and then so are the companies in the fossil fuel sectors. But another more important reason from an ESG perspective is that companies which have more ESG risk management or have stronger ESG metrics often have better risk management. Strong ESG metrics, from my perspective, they are strongly linked to business resilience. A company that has strong ESG management means it takes a more holistic view when considering strategic decisions. Therefore, they have more robust risk management. COVID-19 is affecting companies as well as stakeholders across the value chain, including employees, contractors, suppliers, consumers, and also local communities. Actually, if you look at this from ESG perspective, ESG cover actually the same set of stakeholders as I mentioned before. Company doing well in ESG if they regularly engage with these stakeholders in their ESG process, they may be better positioned to respond to or anticipate the impact of the pandemic. So I'll just give two quick examples to wrap up the first question. So during our engagement, we engaged with one of our investee company, which is in the logistic infrastructure industry. This is a sector associated with high health and safety risk because of the exposure to heavy equipment. The company introduced some automation process into their workflow, so that part of the reason is that they want to reduce the safety risk. But also another reason is that they want to respond to the shrinking workforce in China and Hong Kong. So the company, because of the automation and because of they manage the ESG risk well, they are less affected by the operation disruption due to the lockdown. Another reason is more on the governance part. Overboarding, I think many investors here know that overboarding has been an issue for some of the Hong Kong listed companies. And I think this issue becomes much more obvious in COVID-19 because companies may need to organize more frequent board meetings in order to discuss the business strategies during the crisis. So company with less overboarded directors may be able to make strategic decisions more quickly to respond to the changing situation every day. So that is some of my observation. With that, I will pass back to Tracy.
Thank you, Tim. I'm sure Katherine will be agreeing with you on your observations on the governance piece. Before we go to Katherine, let's start with Sebastian. Over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us. And Tracy, thank you very much for hosting the webinar. In broad terms, I'd very much like to echo the observations that Tim has already shared, in that performance-wise, there has been tremendous resilience, specifically with regard to ESG equities in the broader space. So in terms of performance assessment, I've brought, just to illustrate, brought MSCI ESG leaders low carbon indices, so a combination of best-in-class ESG score as well as a low carbon aspect to that. And those indices are then depicted relative to their standard market cap non-ESG parent universe, so to speak, just to illustrate that both in terms of world and emerging markets as the broader universe, as well as focusing on US and Europe as the key ingredients to develop markets universe, you do see significant and continuous outperformance, or relatively speaking, better performance than the standard market cap indices since the beginning of this year, particularly heightened around the end of Feb, early March, when the majority of the world became aware of this very situation that we have. Again, this is very much driven by a key focus on low carbon on the one hand. As Tim said already, companies with good ESG scores typically would like to have a lower carbon footprint to begin with. But then interestingly enough, also a keen focus on, say, companies in the healthcare focus. So first, arguing that ESG has been more resilient across the board is absolutely a fact. But then one also will need to look in greater detail as to how the ESG indices are really made up in terms of their actual construction that they have, in terms of the actual ingredients and allocation that they have. Because at the end of the day, ESG is still a selection and an allocation play. It's just a different way of defining your universe and allocating your benchmarks. To this end, I also have brought a slide that we call sectors rising opportunities, which intends to just depict on the one hand, the trading activity in the specific markets. I'm not sure if we have that slide on the webinar. It's basically giving you both trading activity in the sectors globally, just to demonstrate that clients really are taking advantage of this situation. But then secondly, we have also looked at cumulative year-to-date flows and performance, just looking at global sectors to illustrate where performance-wise, but then also client allocation-wise, the market really is heading. And there you can see, again, a broad echo of what Tim has already said, and I continue to observe. Energy has been hit heavily, both in terms of performance and flows. A keen focus on healthcare and information technology. Healthcare is fairly obvious, I should say, simply because of the fact that healthcare and healthcare workers are at the forefront of this very situation, desperately needed investments being directed in that area. They historically have featured strongly in the ESG space, but then also, interestingly enough, information technology. Now, infotech is not necessarily a straightforward ESG play, so to speak. Information technology does have its advantages. It is a great enabler. That is absolutely true. But interestingly enough, also, information tech companies typically tend to employ fewer people. And since that, or for that very reason, have higher ESG scores, specifically on the social aspect, which is a very interesting observation, I find. So that brings us again to the other parts that have become extremely relevant and prevalent in this crisis and in this situation. On the one hand, data. So there's clear demand for more data, more granular data, more realistic data, so to speak, because a great part of the ESG universe still relies on estimates or self-reported data that is not necessarily audited. And then secondly, the engagement aspect, where again, it is more important than ever to really engage with the companies that one holds in their portfolio to make sure they have policies in place. They will be bringing policies in place. They will be following up with the promises they have made. Lastly, this is particularly relevant with regard to the social aspect of E, S, and G, where going forward we will be seeing much more scrutiny. And this is it. Tracy, I'd like to give it back. Thank you.
Thank you. Sebastian, it's very interesting. If we can go back to the earlier slide on the charts on the MSCI by sector. Yes, these charts, right? So it looks like ESG investments outperform between 3 to 4% across the globe, right? It doesn't matter whether you look at the US sector, EM, and Europe, and across the world, right?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Do you have, can you also elaborate a little bit from the passive fund perspective and their performance?
So passive fund performance-wise, again, typically you have in the passive space two ways of creating ESG exposures. One, the straightforward one where you select or create an ESG benchmark and then aim to replicate this as closely as possible. This is typically what you see in the ETF space, for instance. So both UCITS ETFs as well as the US 40 Act and the Asian counterparts, of course, where you're trying to track a benchmark as closely as possible. Those products are listed on exchange and hence are used as allocation tools by investors. So performance-wise, they have performed in line with the ESG benchmarks and have given you the performance that you see on the chart. So bang on in line, so to speak. But it's also interesting to note from a flow perspective that while clients have done significant reallocations of their portfolios and have used ETFs as an allocation tool, shedding holdings across all asset classes at the very onset of the situation, but they kept 2 ESG ETFs as a strategic long-term allocation and typically tended to sell and later on begin to reinvest into broad market cap standard non-ESG products and indices. The second way of constructing ESG exposure in the passive space is defining or finding a standard benchmark and index and then create a bespoke ESG policy that you implement at portfolio level. This will always require you to accept a certain level of tracking error relative to your standard benchmark, but gives you greater flexibility with regard to the policy. And also it is basically your very own ESG strategy at portfolio level. This is what we normally do for institutional mandates clients, so larger investors that don't invest in the listed ETF product, but instead want to have their own pool of assets. So again, these more bespoke, higher tracking error strategies, higher as in up to 1% for MSCI World portfolio relative to the standard index, have again performed very much as expected. So in line with the ESG strategy, higher tracking error, slightly better than the standard market cap indices. So again, as Tim and I have said, ESG has proven to be extremely resilient in terms of performance.
Excellent. This is really the facts that we want everyone to know. Tim, do you have anything to add before I move to Katherine?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, so now let's turn to our regulators. Katherine, what's your observation from the listed companies and community perspective?
I think ESG has been a long journey for a lot of our listed companies. They started probably thinking about it 10 years ago, and we, at the regulator side, we initially put ESG as a voluntary reporting requirement, but there's been lots of progress in the last few years, and investors are expecting a lot more information on ESG, like what we've heard from Tim and Sebastian. So in the last couple of years, we started kind of asking companies to disclose ESG. We realized that in order for them to disclose meaningful ESG information, their board need to be focused on it. So this year, when we thought about ESG and how companies could improve, it's very much on the governance of ESG, how the companies are dealing with it, how is it related to the business. I think throughout this COVID-19 scenario, and also other ESG issues we faced in the past, whether it's social unrest or type of mancoot, it shows which companies are better prepared compared to the others. It put their materiality assessments to the test, and it's really an opportunity for them to showcase their preparedness. So I think this whole COVID-19 ESG has brought into light, kind of distinguish the very good, the very prepared, very well-governed company from the ones which live by the day and see what happens from one day to the next. So I think these are the main issues. And with listed issues, we are seeing a lot of improvement, you know, from not thinking about ESG to now every single company on an annual basis, they at least have to assess their ESG risk. So they're getting there, and they're, I guess, from looking at what their peers do and living through different sort of risks and scenarios, they're learning, they're picking it up, and I think they're doing better and better. I think what we want to stress to the listed issuers is ESG is not about data regurgitation. It's not about kind of throwing out a lot of numbers, but it's all about kind of how the companies manage risks as part, and how the risks work into their strategy. So I think it's something that if it's material to them, they should consider, regardless of what the Hong Kong regulatory requirements are. You know, if we always say that if something is material, if it's a material risk, you need to think about how to mitigate it. We just don't want you to forget about ESG risk. But I think generally, companies in Hong Kong are doing much better on ESG.
Thank you, Katherine. So now let's move to CS. So given Hong Kong is a concrete jungle and the importance of physical asset, can you share with us the risk of real assets and the physical asset performance during COVID?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tracy, and also thanks everybody, you know, to squeeze time now listen to what we are now talking about. Yes, I think it's not a secret. Everybody knows that the realty asset, the realty industry, you know, they suffer the most because you know, a lot of things suffer. For example, retail and so on. But at the end of the day, you know, where they actually do the retail, of course, is in the some sort of, I would say, real estate. That is in that kind of real asset and so on. So the office building, for example, if you look at the figures, the statistic and so on, you can see that we have a plummet of that kind of the rental. And also a lot of prime side, you know, in the past, you can see a lot of people, you know, going around, and also the business seems to be something you take it for granted. But now you can see that the many shop already closed and so on. Now, there will be a cascading effect, you know, because the money, you know, if they do not come to the door of the retailer, and then they will not be able to pay the rent, and they will hard hit the I would say physical asset industry. Just how I pointed out by Katherine very correctly, I think over the years, many people working very hard for the purpose actually pushing forward the ESG. As mentioned by Katherine, I totally agree. The ESG is something I would say, when you look at it, it is something to tie with, I would say, risk. If you do not address all this factor well in advance, so eventually they will actually transform itself into some sort of risk factor. And in actual fact, I believe, you know, because of the environment change and so on, therefore we have that kind of COVID-19 and things like those. And in future, about the environmental changes, that kind of, I would say, unusual climatic situation, it become more and more usual and so on. So all these actually, I say, are related together. And actually, funny enough, you look at the current situation, those actually big company in particular, the one who flow in Hong Kong Stock Exchange, they actually invest a lot more than the so small and medium-sized enterprise in the ESG. But unfortunately, they are the one actually at the moment, they are quite hard hit by that problem. So what I hope will not happen is, we see some sort of retreat in the, I would say, the commitment on the ESG. Now, if that is the case, I think in the longer run, as mentioned by Katherine, they become a risk factor. Another issue about the real estate, the physical asset industry is about the supply chain. Now, on one hand, they actually depends on retail, depends on the people, depends on circulation, occupancy, and so on. But on the other hand, the building industry, the real asset, and so on, they're particularly dependent upon some sort of, I would say, raw material, and so on. For example, the building of the real estate and the maintenance, the operation, and so on, they're all dependent on actually that kind of supply. If you look at Hong Kong in particular, I believe most of the city, they cannot have that kind of material supply around the vicinity of the city. They will rely on something far beyond. Now look at what COVID-19 affect most is about transportation. You can see the border is closed and so on. So all in a sudden, they have no actually customer, and on the other hand, they have no supply of the resources for them to actually to run their business. So that is another factor that will actually affect that kind of real asset industry. And in turn, as I say, that will affect the ESG. And what we hope is at this particular moment, it is particular for this moment is that kind of industry really need the support of some sort of finance resources. And as mentioned by Sebastian just now, I hope that kind of trend to say people are more ready to invest in the ESG. And this is a time for them actually to show some sort of mercy and also understanding by releasing, I would say, easing off that kind of fund supply to the industry. Then I think it's going to be China's here. Now remember this, it's not the first time human being attacked by that kind of virus and so on. In particular, Chinese history, every now and then we saw something like this. And the Mother Nature is very kind. Now, sometimes they do punish the children, but they never punish them long. So all this, I would say, is going to be transient. So if we can help the industry to maintain the ESG sort of commitment, maintain that kind of, I say, the liquidity and so on, then soon after, that kind of problem will be passed. Now, if we do not actually react quickly at this moment, then I think we will regret, because some of them already dropped. You look at one of the big companies in Singapore, just because of the, I would say, the liquidity problem. So very sad that such a big company could collapse within such a short time period. So therefore, I think it is time for us to work together to help the industry and then to help ourselves. So this is something that I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you, CS. Definitely, this is the time to all work together. So after hearing from all our speakers, I think one thing is very clear. The COVID-19 pandemic brought up the importance of the social aspect, the S letter of the ESG. So before I go to the next topic, I want to ask all our audience to raise your questions using the Q&A button. Please feel free to ask our speakers any questions and raise your questions using the Q&A message that you can post there. All right, so let's hear from our speakers on what are the key lessons learned about ESG from COVID-19. And this round, let's start with lady first, Katherine. From regulators' perspective, how does it change the focus for policymakers? And if you have any advice for our listed company?
Thank you. I think for COVID-19, we've seen kind of not just locally, but around the world, how companies with different COVID-19 measures have fared, not just from a profit perspective, but also from a reputational perspective. How well they have community investment is an important part of COVID-19. Protecting your employees' wellness is an important aspect of COVID-19. So I think it's brought to light that for companies, it's not just about squeezing last profit, the last cent out of your business, but also protecting, how are you protecting your employees, particularly in a pandemic situation? You know, are you providing them with protective gear? That's to protect your employees as well as maybe your customers. And then for community investment, you know, you might be shut down, your employees might be well protected, but how are you, we always talk about the license to do business in a community. This is a very good opportunity we've seen for you to gain some goodwill and gain some understanding with the community in which you live and work in. So we've seen some companies kind of proactively reach out to their community in the times of difficulties, whether it's through donation or helping seek protective gear or just initiatives. I think it really goes to show that whether a company is operating in a vacuum, you know, I think it's a testimony, it's a demonstration that if you're a manufacturer, let's say, if it's simplest illustration, you're not just about producing things in a factory and you're closed off from everyone else. It's about, you know, how you've worked with people in your company as well as those around you. I think that's probably the main issue that COVID-19 has brought up. And it's also brought up kind of, you know, it's teamwork. What's the leadership at the top looks like in times of crisis. There's opportunity in times of crisis, there's difficulties in management. How quickly, I mean, Tim talked about overboarding and how quickly the companies can react and how much time INEDs can spend. This is an unexpected circumstances. It changes on a daily basis. How quickly a company can react in a crisis will often make or break a company. So reaction time, governance, preparedness is all central to a company's survival, I think, in times of crisis.
Thank you, Katherine. Let's go back to the investors and asset managers' perspective. Perhaps looking a little bit more on the short and long-term impact as well. So shall we start with Tim?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Tracy. So I think we are still in the early stages of understanding the full impact that COVID-19 will have. But I think there are some important implications already emerging. So first of all, COVID-19 provides a chance for company to reveal its resilience to systemic change. COVID-19 has clearly disrupted the economic system. And if you look at climate change, I think climate change actually represents similar systemic risk because they could disrupt economic system across different industries, value chains or regions, just similar to COVID-19. So one interesting thing that I saw yesterday was that the World Economic Forum is helping business to plan their response journey to COVID-19 by building different scenarios. So that actually makes me think of TCFD. I think TCFD, while the standard does not specify on how to manage public health risk like COVID, that it also provides a useful framework for a company to use it to address the governance strategy or risk management parts related to pandemic or public health. So I think in future companies may increasingly use more TCFD-like framework to plan for another systemic change. That's the biggest lesson, I think. But there are also other issues, short-term trends that may have long-term implications. So one thing that we saw from the crisis is that we had a very large experiment on working from home. So essentially, I think most of you had the experience of working from home during the crisis. I think remote working actually creates a better opportunities for employee to handle other responsibility at home. So I'm sure you had the experience of hearing great baby crying in the background while having meetings with your teammates. In the past, it might not be accepted, but right now it's perfectly accepted now. So if remote working becomes a new normal, then I think that could help boost the diversity and inclusion in Asia, which has been seen as a challenge in the region. So that's one. And the other thing I think is on the supply chain. So company will definitely look to diversify or localize their supply chain because of the travel restriction due to COVID-19. I think the emerging markets will be more impacted because many of the industries rely on exports, but then the transition may happen sooner than later, also because of the China-US tension right now. So supply chain is going to be affected soon. And the last thing is on the executive compensation related to the G factors. I think in the current investing environment, shareholders are expecting far lower return than before. And so you can see from the news, many employees are getting pay cut because of the economic situation. So executive compensation will be increasingly scrutinized, and that could set the stage for revamping the compensation scheme, potentially tying it to ESG factors. So yesterday I did a quick research on the Hang Seng Index constituents, and I think only 2% of the companies have the ESG factors linked to the current CEO compensation. So the percentage could increase in future due to COVID-19.
Thanks, Tim. I see the 2% linked to the CEO compensation of the whole Hang Seng Index. I think this is something that we are watching out for closer tie on how the future will plan out for the CEO camp. So Sebastian, can I go to you now? Yeah. Thanks, Tim.
No, we are not on mute anymore. Brilliant. In terms of key lessons and the short and longer term impact, two items to point out. So as we've discussed already, short term, there will be a keen focus from the investor perspective at how companies actually have dealt with the current situation, continue to be dealing with the current situation, to single out those ones, those market segments, those companies that are basically settled or positioned to perform better going forward. I have brought a slide that I called ESG integration going forward, the increasing importance of S, that makes I shouldn't say a bold statement, but essentially something that Katherine already has said. Corporate reputation has the strongest correlation to corporate financial performance. So the reputation of a company is extremely important. DWS have done a number of studies with the University of Hamburg, for instance, to prove that point. And the current situation, again, echoes this very statement. So short-term impact, just briefly looking at how America's largest employers have been responding to the COVID-19 situation. I believe there is quite a stark difference in that half of those companies have introduced working from home. And as Tim has said, probably will have worked well, particularly across the financial industry, for instance. It's more difficult across the retail space or services industry, where typically business relies on meeting people face to face. But the majority of markets actually have taken to it, for better or worse, and customer accommodation. So trying to make sure your clients are happy and your clients remain loyal. But if you look at the rest of the measures, you actually have quite a broader set, and paid sick leave, for instance, only a third of those companies actually have offered that. But you also see furloughs, you see pay reductions, you see reduced service hours. So it's quite a broad set of measures, and not all of them are necessarily positive. That's intuitive, so to speak, because all of the companies are essentially racing to try and save their economic future. That's totally understandable. But it also means that they will have to have a more sensible plan to address this situation now, and to address these kinds of situations going forward. which again demonstrates and highlights the necessity, for instance, for board members and CEOs' pay to be linked to such KPIs in the social aspect, not just the economic well-being of the employees, but also the social situation and having a clear policy in place, for instance. Looking at this from a broader perspective, the ESG universe has started with a focus on governance some 20 plus years ago, if you will. The recent years have seen an intense focus on the environmental aspect, and there's good reason for that. But it also meant that the social aspect specifically has always been a bit, I should say, neglected. It was relevant, yes, but keener focus on engagement and good governance and what's happening to climate change. And for a good reason, as I say, but the social aspect was somewhat neglected, if you will. So going forward, this will be a more relevant and more prominent part of the investment process and the allocation process of clients and asset managers. And separately, some of our clients, for instance, are implementing or have been implementing this already. It always historically has depended on the client makeup, for instance. We serve a European pension fund focused on the social sector, being the pension fund for workers in the social sector of their country. So when they built their ESG strategy with us, there was, of course, a focus on overall improvement of ESG aspects. There was a focus on the reduction of the carbon intensity, but this was rather novel at the time, a keen focus on the health and the safety and the well-being of the employees of those companies they invest on, trying to overweight those companies that do better, underweight those companies that do worse. So this was novel at the time. This will become more commonplace in this situation. But that brings me also to my point around data, where Katherine said the point is not that companies just spill out as much data as possible. I partially agree, I partially disagree, in that I agree it's not about just spilling out data. The question is, what kind of data is it? In that we need to have a more common framework, what information is to be presented, how that information is derived, and what can really be received from that information. So a more common framework of ESG related or relevant information and framework, how that data can be assessed. So for instance, in Europe, you have the European agenda for a more sustainable financial system that also has a matrix, so to speak. So a common set of definitions and measures trying to level the playing field of this onslaught of ESG data, if you will. So I think we do need more data. That's why I disagree. So as a passive manager, it's always about systematically investing, rule-based investing. You take an index, you define a strategy, you have your set of rules, how you bring them in the portfolio. So I'm extremely keen on data, but we need better data, broader coverage, and a clearer framework to make that data across markets compatible. And that's my comment on this point.
Thank you, Sebastian. CS, can I go back to you on how to mitigate ESG risks on real assets?
Yeah, well, I'm talking about something I would say more generic. Now, this time I think the world see that. Don't take things for granted. Now, when you are feeling comfortable and safe and secure and everything seems to be, come just so easy. But all in a sudden, something you take for granted disappear within, I would say, a very short period of time. I think this is the first lesson to learn, not just for ESG or whatever, I think for everything. So I think this is the first thing. Don't take the thing for granted. So may I indulge to use a maximum Chinese, no? That means going on seeing. In English term, that means when you stay comfortable and secure, then always think about the risk is just around the corner. Now, there's no room for complacency, but this time I think everybody agrees. You look around the whole world, who can actually manage the COVID-19? I would say better. I think Chinese people have very good reason to be proud of. One of the reasons is because Hong Kong was hard hit during the SARS period, the year 2003. Now I tell you, this is not a secret. And after that time, actually I always stock in my home a few boxes of masks because I know that The dangers is never too far away. So if we visit you this time, it will come back. Now, actually, it surprised me that it comes actually, I would say more than 10 years afterwards. Actually, I think it will come, I would say sooner. And I would actually caution, the audience. I think this time the COVID-19 is not like SARS. It may not actually go all together within a year or so. It may come back now and then. So this is how the actual human being learn to live with the environment. So we better think in advance. And the second thing is about planning. I totally agree with Sebastian just now. You mentioned about we have to have something well designed and so on and so forth. Again, no room for actually complacency. But when I look at Sebastian chart, I was so happy. The reason is very simple. The first item, right, which the employers are doing is work from home. I tell you what, actually starting from year 2015, I already make my office capable of work from home. So when the COVID-19 attacks me, the other office manager asked me, what happened to me? I said nothing, because I just tell my staff, you just stay home. Why? Because after year 2014, because of social unrest, and sometimes the transportation is being affected. So I say, well, what happened when one day all the trains stopped? What should I do? Now my job is very, very, I would say critical. We are the only company in Hong Kong doing green building assessment, which is actually a public function. So I know that I cannot stop. So therefore, instead of, I would say, wait until something nasty happens, I better do something. So the second lesson, as mentioned Sebastian, so you just make yourself ready for the contingency. And number three, I would say, lesson to learn is you look around the world. What happened is, if we spend time actually doing some sort, I would say, finger pointing, we better do collaboration. So if you do actually something about investigate who actually to be blamed and who actually give me the problem, you better act. So I think the actions speak louder than I would say that kind of argument. Now, I think finding out the cause is important, but this is not during the time when your enemy is attacking you. So if you can work together in a collaboration manner, then you can see that the problem actually could be actually reduced. I think another lesson to learn is, I think is old maxim, 1 ounce of prevention is better than a tons of, I would say, cure. But at the same time, I always try to emphasize one thing. Don't believe that your plan is so good. Something nasty will never happen. If you think in this way, this is a biggest risk forever. So you always think that nothing could be perfect. Now, what about something goes wrong? What will I do? Again, going back to Sebastian, what you say, we just get prepared. I remember a guru, Tom Peters, the one who wrote the book called In Search of Excellency. So actually, more than 15 years ago, I attended a seminar. This is what he said. He said, don't blindly believe in planning, but rather make sure you're adaptive. You can react quickly. So I think this is another lesson to learn. And finally, just one more point about the corporate governance. Never before we see that corporate governance leadership is so important during the crisis. So this is something I want to share with you.
Thank you, CS. I know who to go to when I run out of masks. So thank you. So far we learned about the importance of the social aspect in ESG investing across the whole ecosystem, how ESG investment outperform standard indices, and the key lesson learned. Now let's look at the brighter future, the future of ESG and where the opportunities are. So for this, let's start from investors' point of view. So can we start from Tim?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. So obviously there are lots of opportunities post-COVID. So the one thing that I want to point out is that a pandemic is not an isolated event. There are studies showing climate change may lead to more events like this. So both investors and companies need to have a systematic and integrated approach to tackle this crisis. So after the crisis, as you may have already seen from the news, there will be lots of funding from the government, and the society will be flooded with money. It is actually great to see different regions are showing leadership for green recovery. For example, EU is setting 25% of the recovery budget for climate investment. Canada, for example, also made reporting climate risk as a condition of receiving COVID-19 funding. So with these kind of fundings, there will be lots of opportunities for investors. In terms of investment themes, what we heard from our engagement is that some themes are quickly getting some attention. For example, as I mentioned before, automation of jobs, which may be accelerated by the virus, and also localization of supply chain as well. And also because of the remote working arrangement, there could be more focus on cybersecurity. And in terms of products, there may be more demand for SDG products because COVID-19 is exposing a lot of social issues, such as inequality in income and also access to infrastructure. So even in Hong Kong, I think we have seen some news about some students who may have difficulties to learn from home because the lack of Wi-Fi or computer. So there is so the social issue or the SDG products is actually an area that investor could look out post COVID.
Thanks, Tim. I like the call out for the allocation of our green recovery. Now over to you, Sebastian.
Yes, very swiftly. Going forward, I believe working from home and the increased rollout of working from home will be proving rather interesting in terms of economic performance across the markets. So this will be part of the recovery and will be beneficial from a diversity point of view, quite as Tim has put it, as long as companies manage to figure out how to still form cohesive teams across this working from home setup. Separately, of course, the intuitive ones, IT technology will be a beneficiary of that going forward and a keen focus on healthcare. But I have said recent years have seen quite a focus on the environment. This will continue to be the theme and the opportunity because this market downturn necessitates all countries to invest in some shape of stimulus, if you will, the first packages being readied. And there's across the markets, across the regions, quite some call to tie those sorts of stimulus packages to environmental aspects, to ESG aspects. Two very straightforward examples in Germany, Lufthansa, for instance, requesting a 9 billion euro bailout where the German government is set to take 20% stake in the company. The market has, or investors have essentially demanded that the German government then also tie this to environmental improvements if they give that money to an airplane company that has that emissions situation still. So that's one interesting call. Then secondly, specifically in the real estate space, for instance, one of the stimulus packages that the Europeans are currently preparing are retrofitting buildings in the European space. So buildings are one of the places where you have tremendous potential to reduce energy consumption, carbon emissions, etc. So retrofitting those is both beneficial from an ESG point of view, but also beneficial from an economic stimulus point of view, support the builders, support the workers, etc., etc. But nonetheless, and if you look at the slide that Tracy has now opened, if you look at the right hand of that slide, you do see that the biggest creation of jobs can actually be done by focusing on renewables and energy efficiency, if you look at the climate aspect, if you will. And left hand shows you that 50% of global GDP have already committed or shown intentions to commit to 2050 net zero carbon targets. So there's still another half that could commit to such targets, won't be 100%, but still quite some upside, where again, such countries committing and forming then packages to support such a transition will be creating additional jobs, additional growth, additional opportunity sets. So climate change continues to be the defining factor in the ESG investing space and the defining opportunity.
Thank you. That's music to CS ears on the green building, the energy efficiency market. So why don't we go to CS?
Okay, thank you very much. I fully agree with Sebastian, just on what he said about the climate change and all this sort of thing. In particular, for the two industries that I'm in, the first one is the green building, and the other one is actually the certifying body, the Hong Kong QAA. So what I want to point out is I totally believe in one thing. Number one is standard. What kind of standard? And number two is about the measurement. I always remember the maxim, you get what you measure. Only by measuring, you know how good you are. For example, Sebastian, just now, give you some sort of figure about energy and so on. So actually, I also believe in retrofitting and also I would say retro commissioning. Every now and then, it's just like your body. You do need some sort of health check. So people in the past just to focus, I think, on the functionality of the real asset. So what kind of function it performs. But they sometimes forget about behind the functioning, what they do actually to produce the function. In actual fact, something unseen could be very important. For example, the energy consumption in long term affect, I would say, the natural environment. Now, the COVID-19 again give the whole world lessons. Don't look at just the, I would say, the outlook of the shopping center, for example, but also on, I would say, at the end of the day, how much energy it consumes. And number two is how healthy it could be. So that actually, again, fall within my area. This would say assessment and certifications. So I hope now the industry can actually develop more standard to measure E, measure S, and measure G, and also some sort of scheme which I would say universally accepted, and then we have some sort of assessment. Now only by that kind of auditing purpose, very much like finance, every year you ask the accountant to audit your figures and so on, so you know how healthy your organization is in terms of financial, I would say, condition. So likewise, now I think we have a wide range of measurement, not just energy, not just water, but also I would say the livelihood and the comfortability and also hygiene and health. Now all this, I think the good news is actually is all on the uptrend. For example, for my organization, we have already produced something like the mass or the certification, not just a sample, the mass to take to the laboratory, but the whole, I would say, manufacturing process. Again, we have a new idea regarding the green building. So in the older day, actually we focus on the environment. That environment is actually a natural environment. And also we also have some sort of focus on the human environment. But now more and more, I think it's about the well-being of the individual within the building, because at the end of the day, it is the occupier who use the real asset. So their safety, their health, and then I would say the compatibility with the environment. I think all this could be done through very simple things: auditing, assessment, and certification. This is something that I want to actually, I would say, sell to all the listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, CS. Katherine, over to you.
Thank you. I think we are moving forward on ESG. I also saw on the Q&A just now that there are some questions about what HKEX does. Someone has a question about how we can promote best-in-class disclosure. I think it's about building up an ecosystem. It's not just, it's very hard for HKEX to lay down the rules because this is not a data disclosure exercise, and what is best in class should not be judged by HKEX. It should actually be judged by our investment community like Tim and Sebastian. So I think how we can get into best in class ESG reporting, I mean, whether a company has good ESG reporting, to me, is depending on the assessment needs to come from the investors. If the investors think that this is a helpful report, it tells you the company's ESG landscape, then I will term it as success. I will consider it successful. But I don't think it's right for the regulator to dictate the information that should be disclosed. But we've of course provided a framework and kind of started the companies on it and get them thinking. And I think CS is absolutely right. You know, we need to have some standards. So it's a bit like financial reporting. When we started, everyone's kind of a bit all over the place, working out what's the best form of disclosure and wanting it to be comparable when everyone is still doing their own thing. But hopefully, I think as we move out and more company disclose and more investors look at it, we will come to an agreement as a financial industry, as a financial community that look at these information and decide what is the best standard. So I'm looking forward to that conversation, and I'm looking forward to be part of it and see how we can help at the exchange. But I think generally, if more users, if there's a better conversation and we can facilitate that at the exchange, if there's a better kind of conversation from the investors about, you know, this is what you want, this is helpful, this is not, and issuers say, hey, I have difficulty with this, and do you really need this information? I think as a market as a whole, we will come up with better reporting. At the exchange, I mean, we do realize that a lot of the companies are producing information on regurgitating data. So if you don't want it, you should tell them about it. So we at the government, I mean, the SFC, HKMA, the exchange, all the regulators are sitting together and thinking about taxonomy and you know, what are the principles for ESG disclosure, and we're all working together. So hopefully the industry as a whole will come up with some standards for both investors and issuers to follow.
Thank you, Catherine. This is perfect timing to roll on to our questions and answer sessions. I see a couple of questions being posed. Sally, you're on the phone. I think you have some prepared questions as well. Why don't we address the two questions from the audience, and then if you have anything, let's try to take three. Sally? Okay, never mind. I can see those questions. So I think these two questions go to Tim and Sebastian. So how can we spot greenwash funds, and what are the key social factors that have strong correlation to investment return? Can you share on these two questions? And maybe we start with Sebastian this time.
Thank you. Specifically on the greenwashing funds part, there is no straightforward way of doing this at this stage, because you don't have clear ESG labels at fund level, and basically you could call anything ESG. So still requires investors to actually look at how strong ESG features in investment decisions and how it is implemented. I mean, there are products out there that claim to be ESG, but it's a screening light approach that from an MSCI world will only filter out like 5 names, but can still be called ESG. So the risk of greenwashing is theoretically there. Specifically in the index space, there are measures being taken to avoid that concept of greenwashing. Again, referencing the European agenda for a more sustainable financial system. There's also a specific part on the design and the impact of low carbon and climate or Paris aligned benchmarks that basically prescribes what indices need to have as a feature in order to be called an official EU low climate or Paris aligned benchmark, which clearly has spelled out the avoidance of greenwashing. So if you look at this as one shape of label, funds aiming to replicate or at least have as a reference universe in the active space, such EU-approved benchmarks, for instance, that gives you quite some indication already. But in terms of specific label, there is no way other than doing the hard work of the fund selector and look at what you're actually doing. Specifically at the social aspect, I have to comment that on a broader macro view that is the passive investment space. There is no individual factor that we have identified that works across the board, because it's always highly specific to certain markets or certain industries, if you will. Say, for instance, the American healthcare aspect also has borne some resemblance as to how American companies in a broader set have dealt with the market as is. So you can't just translate one measure across the developed and the emerging market space, if you will. So that instead necessitates that companies as a whole have higher social scores, so to speak, and their directors, their board, and their CEO have a demand and the requirement to look at this as part of their pay package as well. So you don't have that single social factor that gives you good performance, but you can, in broad terms, say that a company that has a sufficient policy in place and follows through is likely to show better performance.
Thank you,
to you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think I echo Sebastian's comments on many of the greenwashing, how to identify greenwash funds and the social aspect. I just want to add that I think the two key areas for asset managers to be truly ESG is their engagement and policy voting. So first of all, engagement. I think it is very important for asset managers to be transparent on engagement. So in terms of what issues do they talk with the company management, and whether the engagement are linked to the real world ESG outcome, such as improving greenhouse gas emission, etc. So I think it is very important for asset managers to maintain high transparency on the engagement outcome. That's the first point. And the second point is on policy voting. And I think it is also important to see how the asset manager votes, especially for shareholder proposals, and how and what are the rationale of voting for or against the management when some of the proposals on E&S comes up. So I think I would just conclude by transparency on both policy voting and engagement. And for the social factor, I think it is difficult because traditionally it is not easy to quantify social factors. But I think after COVID-19, it is a very good chance for investors to refocus their efforts on social. So as I said, I think SDG is one of the very important metrics to measure how asset managers or companies are doing in terms of social. And I think in terms of metrics related to investment outcomes, there were some studies on diversity, especially on gender diversity on board, that higher female gender diversity could link to higher ROE. So that is, but those studies are mainly focused on Europe or US market. I am not sure if there is any relevant study on Asia. So that is something that we could explore in future.
Tracy, may I make a quick echo to what the team and Sebastian say? Just a short one.
Of course.
Yes. Actually, I want to echo the point about, I say, greenwashing and so on. Now, because I say there are two stages. The first one is you try to do some sort of cosmetic to make something green. But at the end of the day, the best actually checking point is the result that produced, as mentioned by team eventually. So again, I would like to say, for example, for our green fund sort of certifications, so we actually measure, I would say, upfront, whether that kind of, I would say, a commitment, that kind of, I say, attribute, as mentioned by a potential fundraiser, could actually yield the result. But at the end of the day, if you also measure about the end result, then I think we can automatically, I would say, wash away a lot of greenwashing. And also, if the industry, actually, they know that. Now, everybody, when they go in the market, they need to actually walk the talk. Then I think the greenwashing will be sort of much reduced, which will be beneficial to both the investor and also, I think, the fund user at the end of the day. So I think greenwashing is an issue, but I think we do have a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have addressed quite a few questions. And given the times, I would ask all our speakers to share their parting takeaway view with us, 1 minute each. So who want to start?
Lady first.
Lady first, Catherine.
Thank you. I was just thinking what's the best, my parting word. I think for ESG, I would say kind of my parting word is less but more in depth is better than more. I mean, from where I'm sitting and seeing what our listed issuers are doing, a lot of them are producing a lot of, I think, irrelevant data. I think it's what is important is for the company to sit down as a board and with their management to work out which are the important and material ESG risks and do a deep dive into those issues and think about mitigation and disclosure. It's much better than what a lot of companies are doing at the moment. They're kind of throwing out a lot of ESG information, you know, whether it's environment or employees or community investment. They are representing that every single ESG aspect is important to them. And if they do that, it kind of loses the focus. So my parting word would be, you know, for every single company, their board to look at their ESG issues, do the materiality test, work out what's important to them, and just disclose and manage material ESG risks. Thank you. Thank you. CS, why don't you go?
Okay, so you respect the senior citizen. Okay, I go. Just two things, I think, at least. Number one is, at the moment, we are, I would say, hard hit by the COVID-19. But you look at the human history. Every time when we are hit hard enough, then with the fundamental we think about where we are and where we are heading for. So you look at the history of development every time when we have some sort of disruptive, Then after the disruption, actually we can move actually forward even better than yesterday. And also the disruption is a differentiation point. So differentiate, I think, from the one who can adapt, the one who can change, from the one who cannot change, who cannot adapt. I think it's quite normal because it's a sort of evolution. So in other words, the disruption is a chance for the one who perform well, I would say, to perform better. And then I think the good days will be actually lying ahead. So that's the first point. The second point is about ESG. Now, to be very frank, I think many people, they try to do some sort of ESG reporting. I think most of them see it as a burden. They say, well, if you ask me to do, for example, Catherine asked me to do it, okay, I just do it. As mentioned by Catherine, right? Why are you so troublesome? Give me a lot of things to report and so on. But if they look at that, to today, again, that kind of incident already tells us so clearly that ESG, I would say, is an investment. It is not a consumption. You do not consume resources on doing that kind of declaration, but rather you invest in ESG in order to make yourself stronger, the community stronger, and so on. So in other words, it is something so real. If you can do it better, as mentioned by the other speaker, you can actually buy down the risk in the future. So once you have a problem in future, you can see that your governance, your leadership, and also your social relationship, and also your care about environment, they will become your friends and just help you to differentiate from the others. So therefore, these are the two things I want the audience can perhaps share with me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, CS. Why don't we go to Tim?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. So I think my parting word would be we need to recognize that the crisis may delay many of the ESG initiatives in this space because the priority right now is clearly on saving lives and also on reopening the economy. So investors may probably expect this because as we engage with companies, the management may tell you their priority may change. So I think as an investor, we need to respect the priority may change, but also to ensure ESG is not forgotten. So that is my major point. And I also want to echo what CS said about the new normal. So I think after each crisis, there will be a new normal. And as I think as many of the panelists have mentioned, ESG will play a very key role in the new normal. So it's up to the investors and companies to step up the ESG commitment to capture the opportunities.
Thanks, Tim. Sebastian.
Yes, my key or three key takeaways would be ESG clearly has proved its mettle in the current market circumstances. So when previously it may have been seen as a philosophical or ethical play, if you will, now investors really have the proof that it also gives performance benefits. And we have discussed the opportunities we see in the space. Secondly, passive is extremely well suited to include ESG due to its rule-based nature, but we rely on data. And that because of the deluge of data, we need better data standards in order to what the information really is worth. And lastly, since passive is rule-based and we invest or divest from companies based on those investment strategy rules, we also need to have a keen focus on engagement, a qualitative approach rather than a tick-the-box exercise where the engagement and corporate governance teams of the asset manager really speak with the companies, demand transparency, and create transparency for the investors and the fund managers. This is my summary. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me to thank all our speakers for sharing their insights on the impact of COVID-19 on ESG investing and on physical assets, the lesson learned and future opportunities. The key takeaway for me from these webinars are the current pandemic has brought up the importance of the social aspect of ESG investing, where ESG investment outperforms standard indices, the increasing focus on ESG regulation, and finally, let's not forget, collaborations, work together is our responsibility to ensure we have a green and sustainable recovery, regardless what our roles are. So thank you very much. Thank you for attending the ESG in Time of COVID-19 webinar today, organized by HKGFA. Please follow HKGFA for our upcoming webinars and events. Thank you all and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.